Hey there, and welcome into another episode of the Route 1 Rundown. If you eat, sleep, and breathe Maryland basketball, then this is the place for you. I'm your host, Steve Borghi, and I'm thrilled to be back for another episode to talk some Terps. But before I dive into everything that's been going on with Maryland since the season ended, just a reminder that this show is on YouTube and part of the Department of Hoops, a DMV media network. So if you're listening to this show in audio form, but you want to be watching it, you got to go and check it out on YouTube. That's youtube.com/@Department of Hoops. You can find this show, and you can find so much other great coverage around local basketball, whether you're into the Wizards, whether you're into the Terps, whether you're into mid-major basketball in the DMV. It's all there on the Department of Hoops, so make sure you go and check it out, and you can subscribe to that channel. You can subscribe to this show so you won't miss an episode. You can also find me all across the internet, all at the same handle, at Gorgon Sports. That's Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok. At Gorgon Sports is where you can find me all across those social media channels. But let's dive into what's been going on in College Park. And of course, the big news, which is now nearly a week old, is that Kevin Willard has decided to go to Villanova. He's decided to leave Maryland, and Buzz Williams, formerly of Texas A&M, is now the new head coach at the University of Maryland. So, look, I'm sure you've read plenty. You've heard plenty. There's been a lot of ink spilled about this hire. You might have listened to Buzz Williams' introductory press conference. You know the basics on the guy. He's had a very successful career as a college basketball coach. Most recently, he was at Texas A&M. Before that, he was at Virginia Tech. Before that, he was at Marquette. And to some extent, he's won everywhere he's been. He's made a bunch of NCAA tournaments. He made an Elite Eight at Marquette. He made a Sweet 16 at Virginia Tech. By and large, he has won. And by and large, he has jumped around a bunch as well. But you know kind of those basic things about Buzz Williams at this point for sure. I'm sure of it if you're listening to this show. So I want to provide a little bit of a different perspective today. Everybody, when a coach is hired, talks about if it's a good hire, it's a bad hire, ranking the hire, right? The truth of the matter is nobody really knows. Nobody knows. There are countless examples throughout college basketball history, throughout college football history, throughout sports history, where a guy who is seemingly a perfect fit for a job fails. Archie Miller at Indiana comes to mind. Shaka Smart at Texas is another one. There's so many examples. On the football side, there's a million. Throughout sports history, there's a million of them. So everybody wants to get out first and say, this is a home run hire, or this is a failure of a hire. There's no way he'll fit here. Oh, this is a perfect fit there. At the end of the day, everybody is guessing. There are things you can try to look into to glean whether the person will be a success or not, whether it's a right fit, what their tenure will look like. But at the end of the day, you don't know until you know. And that's just the truth of the matter. So what I want to talk about a little bit more today than whether Buzz Williams will be a success or failure at Maryland is what this represents for Maryland and what this hire represents in college basketball. Because I have come to the realization since this hire was announced that this is a bit of a landmark moment for Maryland basketball. This signifies a brand new era, a brand new time in the history of this program, because Maryland basketball has been defined by and large by two people: the long run that Lefty Driesell had and the long run that Gary Williams had. And that is college basketball kind of in a nutshell. It's defined by these long runs, by these legendary coaches, guys that were at school 20, 30, 40 years. Tom Izzo's kind of the last of a dying breed at Michigan State. Obviously, Coach K, probably the best coach of all time, was at Duke forever. Dean Smith at North Carolina forever. John Thompson, a long run at Georgetown. Denny Crum at Louisville. The list goes on, but Jim Boeheim at Syracuse. But when you think about college basketball, that's what you think about. You think about these coaches who have been in one spot, in one place forever. And Maryland is no different. Maryland is defined by these long runs of success, by First, Lefty Driesell, and then later Gary Williams, who of course took the Terps to the mountaintop. It's the most successful period in Maryland basketball history, but Lefty Driesell had a ton of great seasons in the 70s and early 80s at Maryland too, which really laid the foundation for Maryland being a basketball school. But that's the history of Maryland basketball. That's the history of college basketball. That's what it has kind of always been. And with the hire of Mark Turgeon right after Gary Williams retired, I was kind of able to buy into this narrative and this notion that Mark Turgeon is a guy who played at Kansas. He grew up, around big-time college basketball. He was at a basketball school, a basketball crazy state in Kansas. He was on a Final Four team. He knows what it's all about to be at a big-time basketball school. And he was coaching at Texas A&M, and he really wanted to be at Maryland because he wanted to be at a place where basketball was the most important thing. At Texas A&M, that's never going to be the case. Football will always be top dog. Football will always be the top priority. But at Maryland, it was different. It was more like Kansas. And, I don't know in the entire sport if there's anybody truly like Kansas and Kentucky. I think Kansas and Kentucky may be a class on their own, even above Duke, above North Carolina, above Indiana in terms of the expectations and the rabidness of those fan bases. But the idea was, and the narrative when Mark Turgeon was hired to replace Gary Williams is, this is a guy who understands what it's like to be at a basketball school. He's at a football school right now. He wants to be at a basketball school, and he's going to come and be the next great coach in this long line of coaches. He's going to be a guy who could be here 20 years and usher in the next era of Maryland basketball. And Mark Turgeon had I will say Mark Turgeon had a fairly successful run at Maryland. He made some NCAA tournaments. He had some good teams. Unfortunately, probably his best team will never find out how they would have done in the NCAA tournament because it was, of course, canceled. But ultimately, Mark Turgeon did not have the kind of run that Gary Williams had. Mark Turgeon's teams struggled to get over that hump. It constantly felt like they played their best basketball earlier in the season while other teams were getting better and improving in February and March. Maryland tended to fade down the stretch in that era of basketball. And overall, it was not quite good enough. Maryland and Mark Turgeon go their separate ways, and then comes Kevin Willard. And with Kevin Willard, the idea was, okay, you kind of had this narrative, all right, Kevin Willard's an East Coast guy, he's a New Jersey guy that has had all this success in the Big East at Seton Hall, a place that's under-resourced, underfunded, they have some history, but it's not a place in the Big East like a Villanova, like a UConn, where there's all these championships in history. Seton Hall is a good job. Seton Hall is a program with history, but it's an underfunded place. It's an under-resourced place. It's not certainly a blue blood of college basketball, and Kevin Willard had done a really nice job there. And coming off the heels of the Mark Turgeon era, it was, okay, Mark Turgeon was a Kansas guy, a Midwestern guy. Maybe he didn't quite fit personality-wise with the Maryland fan base, with the culture of Maryland basketball, but Kevin Willard is a guy who is an East Coast guy. He gets it. He has his introductory press conference. He talks about watching Steve Francis. He talks about the Gary Williams era, bringing swagger back to Maryland. And the narrative is, okay, this guy could be the next to really embrace and understand Maryland and be this next great coach in this long line of great coaches. Because that's always what you've been searching for in college basketballs. How can we find the next great coach who's going to be at our program for 20, 30 years and have this unbelievable run like a Tom Izzo, like a Jim Boeheim, like a Dean Smith, like a Gary Williams, like a John Thompson? That's always been the idea. That's always been what it's been all about. So you're sold this narrative, and I bought into it certainly, that Kevin Willard could be that guy because he gets it. He gets what it's like to be a basketball guy in the Northeast. And he's going from this underfunded program at Seton Hall to Maryland, which is a basketball school and is in the Big Ten now and has all this money and can do more. And lo and behold, Kevin Willard ultimately leaves after just 3 years to go back to the Big East, to go to Villanova, because seemingly for the most part, Villanova has more resources to spend on basketball, on men's basketball. But the idea, and what I'm getting at here, is with both the Turgeon and the Willard hire, the idea was we're going to find our next great coach who can go lead this program for 20 years. And that's always what Maryland has seemed to look for. That's always what everybody in college basketball has seemed to be seeking out when they make a hire, because that is traditionally how you are successful. You get a great coach who is there forever. They build a culture, they build a program, and if they're really, really good, they will take you to Final Fours, they will take you to national championships, they will be in contention for conference titles. They do all those things over a long period of time. So now we enter the third hire since Gary Williams retired at Maryland. And Gary Williams retired following the 2011 season. I mean, we are nearly 15 years at this point removed from the Gary Williams era at Maryland. And Maryland hires Buzz Williams. And I think I see it very clearly that Buzz Williams will not be a guy like Gary Williams. Buzz Williams will not be a guy like Jim Boeheim, not be a guy like Jim Calhoun, who is going to stick at his school for 20 years and be everything that school, represent that school, be the face of that university. That is not going to be Buzz Williams, because Buzz Williams, over the course of his career, has not done that. Buzz Williams has jumped around a lot. Marquette, Virginia Tech, Texas A&M. And Gary Parrish, a CBS Sports national college basketball writer, does a great job, very connected with coaches and in the industry, talks to a lot of coaches. I heard him on his, he does a national college basketball podcast, but he also has a local Memphis show where he was talking about an article he wrote about Buzz Williams back in 2014 after he had left Marquette for Virginia Tech, where he talked to Buzz Williams about why he left and, you know, the way he thinks and the way his brain works. And he basically summed it up as Buzz Williams identified the fact that after about 6 or 7 years at a program, whether you've exceeded the standard that was set before you or not, you have now reset the standard and are held to those expectations. So in other words, no matter what the program looked like before you got there, if over a 6-year period you made the NCAA tournament 6 times, you went to a bunch of Sweet 16s, and that is now the expectation. And you have to beat that over the next 6 or 7 years. Or you could go to a new program and kind of reset things. That's how Gary Parrish summed that up. Buzz Williams' mindset. Now, there was also a thought that Buzz Williams was looking to maybe get out of Marquette because of uncertainty in the Big East, of uncertainty at the time with the Big East no longer being on ESPN, going to Fox Sports, with the Big East. And of course, the Big Ten is not on ESPN. Big Ten basketball is not on ESPN. It's on Fox Sports. It's on CBS. It's on Peacock, but it's not on ESPN. There was uncertainty around, what the college sports landscape looked like for a non-football playing conference in this era of realignment, which is kind of ironic given that Kevin Willard just went to Villanova because they could provide more resources to basketball. And we'll see if that continues to be true. I have my doubts about that there will ever be a time going forward that the Big Ten and SEC allow their schools, their member institutions, to be at a disadvantage in anything that they remotely care about against another conference. So I have my doubts on how long the Big East will have any advantage in that regard, but it is kind of ironic nonetheless. But that was kind of how Gary Parrish summed up Buzz Williams' mindset, is that it's essentially a good thing to move on to a new program every 6 or 7 years. And that's what Buzz Williams has done in his career. 6 years at Marquette, 5 years at Virginia Tech, 6 years at Texas A&M. And when he went to Texas A&M, everybody said, oh, this is his dream job. He's a Texas guy. He'll be there forever. Well, now he's Maryland's head coach, and he had good success at Texas A&M. They had a group this year that was a veteran group that I did expect a little bit more from this Texas A&M team, given what they were able to do last year and given all the pieces they brought back. But look, they went and got a 4 seed in the NCAA tournament. They made it to the second round, got knocked out by Michigan, but they were a 4 seed in the NCAA tournament. You look at Texas Tech's basketball history, it's few and far between the times that Texas A&M has been a protected seed. It was this season, before that 2016 under Billy Kennedy, before that they were a 3 seed that year, before that 2007 under Billy Gillespie, and I'm not sure the last time before that, because I'm looking at the KenPom page right now, and it only goes back to 1997. So, since 1997, there's been 3 times that Texas A&M has been a protected seed. This year was one of those times, and this was the group that Buzz Williams had built, and they had some success, not as much tournament success as they would have liked, losing in the first round of the SEC tournament, or in their first game of the SEC tournament to Texas, and then losing in the second round of the NCAA tournament to Michigan. But by and large, a very successful run by Texas A&M standards. So when I look at Buzz Williams and his track record and what he's done, it's not to criticize or say it's wrong. It's just that it's different. It's different than what Maryland seemingly has been searching for. It's different than what all of these college basketball programs search for, which is somebody to lead the program and be the face of that institution for 20 years, 30 years. And the reality is there is nothing about Buzz Williams, whether it's his track record, whether it's this article and conversations with Gary Parrish, there is nothing about Buzz Williams that indicates he's the kind of guy who is going to be at Maryland for 20 years. He's going to be at Maryland for 30 years. And I mean, just given, his age alone, he's not old, he's 52. I mean, it makes sense he's not going to be there for 30 years. But, he could certainly coach until he's 72. He could certainly continue coaching college basketball for 20 more years. But there is nothing about his track record or anything we've seen or heard from him that indicates that is what he will do. And I think that's okay. I think my biggest takeaway is that this is just a different era of college basketball. This is just something different. This is just something new and something that we all, as college basketball fans and observers, have to get used to. I think going forward, it's going to be rare that we see a Tom Izzo. I think Tom Izzo was just about the last of that generation, the last of that breed who is going to, Tom Izzo's an anomaly in the fact that he's only been a head coach at Michigan State. That's the only place he's ever been a head college basketball coach. Tom Izzo was an assistant at Michigan State from 1983 to 1995, and then got his first head coaching job as the head coach of Michigan State in 1995. That's not going to happen anymore. And that's okay. It's just different. It's a different era of college basketball. It's an era where players come and go year by year, and it might be an era of college basketball that starts to look a lot more like what a coaching tenure looks like in the NBA, what a coaching tenure looks like in the NFL. You don't rarely, who do you see outside of Greg Popovich, who is an NBA coach in the same place for 20 years? It's extraordinarily rare. Greg Popovich is a guy. Eric Spoelstra is a guy who's probably on his way to a career like that. But outside of those guys, it is so rare to be in one place as an NBA coach for 20 years, to be the face of a franchise for 20 years. It just doesn't happen, and Spoelstra's closing in on. Now he's now been the Heat head coach since 2008, which is unbelievable. But I think that as we continue to professionalize college basketball more, and make no doubt about it, that's the direction college basketball is heading. I don't say that with any judgment. I really don't. I don't say that with judgment. I say that just in, that's the reality of the situation. And I think you might start to see more coaches like Buzz Williams, who are somewhere for 5, 6, 7 years, and then they're on to a new job. So my perspective when I look at this hire, and at first, like, I'll admit it, at first I looked at it and I was like, well, he has a good track record. You know, I think he's a good coach. He can certainly win. He can certainly get teams to the tournament. He can certainly advance in a tournament. He hasn't gone to a Final Four, but look, he can win. But I was like, he's not going to be around. There's nothing that says he's going to be around. And what I started to realize is that may just be the way college basketball is headed. That may just be the reality of this new era. So that's my take on the Buzz Williams hire. That's my perspective on the Buzz Williams hire. I don't know whether he's going to be successful. I truly don't. And anybody who tells you they are 100% certain it's a home run or they're 100% certain it's a failure is absolutely full of it. And look, you can find a ton of people who will say either one. There's people out there who would say this is the best hire Maryland possibly could have made. This guy's a winner. He's successful every year. He's going to be a home run hire. He's going to kill it at Maryland. And there's a bunch of people out there who will say, look at his analytical profile. His teams recently don't shoot enough threes. They don't shoot well enough. They're too focused on getting to the line and offensive rebounds. He hasn't shown that he has a super efficient offense that can get you to a national championship, that can get you to a Final Four. There's no way it's going to work. You can find plenty of people who will tell you both of those things. And I will say, I think both sides of that argument are absolutely full of it, because throughout college basketball history, there have been a ton of examples of people who seemed like home runs and failed, and people who you weren't really sure about and ended up having great runs. I mean, look, Tony Bennett, I think, is a great example at Virginia. Tony Bennett did some really impressive things when he was at Washington State. I mean, that's a program that does not have a good history. It's as remote as it can possibly be. And Tony Bennett was able to do some really impressive things there. To get them to a Sweet 16 is unbelievable. But for him to go from Wazoo to Virginia and win a national championship there and really challenge Duke and North Carolina year in and year out, I don't know that anybody saw that and said, oh, that is a slam dunk given Virginia's history. Virginia has a decent history, right? You've had guys like Ralph Sampson come through the program. They've had good years, but they've had a lot of bad years too, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s. That was not a program that was winning at a very high level. I don't think it was obvious to anybody that Tony Bennett could come in there and challenge Duke and North Carolina for the top of that league year in and year out. I've talked about it before on various other shows I've done, not part of the Route 1 rundown, but that run that Virginia had between 2014 and 2019 is one of the best runs that we've seen over the last 20 years. Over that span, they got a 1 seed, 2 seed, 1 seed, 5 seed, 1 seed, 1 seed, and they won a national championship in that span. That was one of the most consistent, impressive 6-year stretches that we've seen over the past couple of decades. And I don't know that anybody, when Tony Bennett was hired at UVA, could foresee that happening. So, look, there are guys that look like home runs and fail. There are guys that you're maybe not sure about and end up being home runs. I think anybody that tells you they're sure this is a home run or they're sure this is a failure of a hire is absolutely full of it. What I can tell you is I think there are a few things that he will have to do, Buzz Williams will have to do, in order to be successful at Maryland. And I think first and foremost is he's going to have to be willing to adapt to whatever is next in college basketball, whatever is next in this new era. And I talked about how he may be representative of a new era for Maryland and a new era for college basketball where you have guys that are in one place just 5, 6, 7 years. They're not 20, 30-year kind of guys at a place. And I think we have entered this era where I don't think there's ever been a time where what you did in the last 10 years is less indicative of how you may perform in the next 10 years. Because college basketball in 2025, 2026 looks nothing like it did in 2015 and 2016. It's a completely new era with a completely new way of building a roster, of acquiring talent. And I think it's critical, no matter who the coach was, I would say this. It is critical that he is willing to adapt to that and figure out how to be successful in that era. Now, I talked about that Gary Parrish article on Buzz Williams back in 2014. I talked about how Buzz Williams was looking at the landscape of college basketball and what it might look like to compete at a national level in the Big East, and if he was maybe better off out elsewhere. That does make me think he's the kind of guy who is thinking about things like that, who might be willing to adapt. I think that's a fairly positive indicator. But when you look around the country, the programs, the coaches, the teams that are successful are the ones that are going to figure out how to best succeed in this NIL transfer portal era. It's the programs that get that right, that understand how to allocate their funds, that understand how to quickly get guys to gel together year after year, that understand what kind of guys they are looking to get in their program and can bring that to fruition. Those are the programs that are going to succeed. And you don't have to look much further than the Final Four right now in the national championship game. Houston and Florida are going to play on Monday night. And Kelvin Sampson is an old school kind of coach. He is an old school guy. But you look at what they've done in the transfer portal just this season. I mean, they lose Jamal Shed, one of the best point guards in the history of that program, one of the best players in the history of that program. And they're able to go out into the portal and find a guy in Milo Suzan who is able to seamlessly fit into that team and buy into what they're doing. And you don't play for Kelvin Sampson unless you buy in, unless you understand the assignment, unless you're willing to do the things that you need to do to win games on the defensive end. And Milo Suzan is a guy who was at Oklahoma that they were able to go out and get and who has fit seamlessly into this team as their point guard. LJ Cryer, to me, the star of that team, is another guy they were able to go out and get a couple years ago. He was at Baylor. He spent 3 years at Baylor. And at Baylor, he really seemed more like a scorer, honestly. A scorer, a shooter. When you thought LJ Cryer, that's always what I thought when I thought about him at Baylor. But they've brought him into Houston, and he has fit. He has understood what it means to be a Houston Cougar, and he's still a prolific scorer. I mean, the guy's shooting 43% from beyond the arc this season. He can light it up with the best of them. He made some big-time shots in that game against Duke in that great comeback, but he has bought in, and he understands what he has to do on the defensive end. And that's what I mean by adapting. It's how do you find those guys? How do you find those right guys in the transfer portal? Because so many times in this transfer portal era right now, you are recruiting guys over a week on Zoom and figuring out whether they are the right fit for your program and whether they're going to come in and be a contributor or not. I mean, it's a tough job. And the programs and the coaches that figure out how to best allocate their resources, how to best scout, how to best bring in guys that are going to be guys that they can win with and guys who will fit into their system, fit with a team. Those are going to be the coaches that are going to be most successful in this new era. So that is what Buzz Williams has to do to be successful at Maryland. Now, part of that will come with an investment from the administration in basketball. That is part and parcel with that. And it does seem like maybe one good thing that has come from Kevin Willard leaving is the fact that a lot of people at Maryland seem to have stepped up and said, we do want this to be a national championship caliber program. They were prepared to offer Kevin Willard a lot in terms of both salary and resources when they were trying to re-sign him. And it sounds like that's something with Willard leaving that Buzz Williams will get as well. And that's part and parcel of being able to adapt to what's next in college basketball. And Scott Van Pelt talked about it extensively on his show, the SVP pod, whatever it is. I mean, obviously, you're listening to this show. You know Scott Van Pelt. You know what he means to Maryland. You know how involved he is in the program. And he has talked about how a lot of people were willing to step up when Kevin Willard asked them to step up. And it really seems like Buzz Williams will have that support. So that might be one good thing that has come out of that. But that is part of being able to adapt to this next era of college basketball. And then the one thing I think Buzz Williams is going to have to do that is a little more old school, a little more traditional when you think about how you build a winning college basketball team at Maryland is he is going to have some local representation on this staff as an outsider, as a guy who doesn't have a connection to this area, as a guy who is a Texas guy, as a guy who just isn't connected to DC, to Baltimore, to this area like other coaches are. He is going to have some local presence, because I still believe, even in an era where the transfer portal is so important, one of the things about this job that does make it special is the access to talent. There is so much great talent in this 295 corridor, in DC, in Baltimore, in the areas in between. It's one of the most talent-rich areas for basketball in the entire country. I mean, you can put it up against any place out there. You can put it up against New York, against Chicago, against Atlanta, against Houston, against DFW. It is right up there with anybody as far as the most talent-rich areas in the country. And even if you're not getting guys on the first go-round right out of high school, take a guy like Rodney Rice, for example, who's from PG County, played at DeMatha, went to Virginia Tech, and then came back home to Maryland. Now, part of that is you have to build those relationships in the high school recruiting process. Of course, you're always going to have to now, in this new era, have the requisite NIL available to draw guys in. But there is still a relationship element of that. And I will always believe having people who know the region, who know the area, who know the high school programs, who know the AAU programs, who know those coaches, who know those trainers, who are training these athletes from a young age, who have those relationships, I will always believe that is going to matter. So, of course, you want to give a guy latitude to bring in his staff, to build a staff that he thinks will allow him to be successful. And I would be shocked if there are not some guys who join him from Texas A&M. But I think there has to be some local representation on this staff just because of the talent-rich nature of this area. Just because that's one of the advantages of this job is how close you are to so much elite basketball talent. And that's whether you get these guys out of high school or whether you're just opening yourself up to the possibility that maybe they go somewhere else and maybe it becomes a fit down the road via the transfer portal. I think you have to keep those relationships going. You have to make sure you're in good with the high school coaches in the area, with the trainers in the area, with the AAU coaches in the area. And, that is certainly something that a head coach can build and develop, and I would expect Buzz Williams to do so. I think if he didn't, it would be malpractice, quite honestly. But I have no reason to believe that he wouldn't go and try to build those relationships. It just makes it so much easier when you have somebody on your staff who already has those relationships, who already knows these coaches, who has already put in the sweat equity to build these relationships. It just opens so many doors for you. So that's the third and final thing that I think Buzz Williams is going to have to do at Maryland in order to be successful. He is going to have to build great local relationships. He's going to have local representation in the staff to just make it that much easier to build those relationships and open those doors. So now let's talk about what Buzz Williams has actually done so far since he's been at Maryland. I should mention on the staff front, there have been no announcements so far on what his staff will look like. And I'm sure we'll be talking about that in the weeks to come here as more developments come. But let's talk about what he has done already from a roster building perspective, because there are a few names out there and there are a few guys who are set to join Maryland, and Maryland will need it because this roster is going to look completely different than it did a year ago. So let's talk about the guys who are set to join Maryland right now. And a couple guys from Texas A&M who played for Buzz Williams last season are set to join the Terps via the transfer portal. First, you have 6'9" big Pharrell Payne, and Payne is a really solid pickup. He's a good rebounder, good offensive rebounder, good rim protector. He was 7th in the SEC in offensive rebounding percentage, 6th in block percentage, and 5th in two-point field goal percentage. He averaged just over 10 points per game and just over 5 rebounds per game. He is a good piece for Maryland to have. Now, he's also a guy who spent his first 2 years of college basketball at Minnesota, so he knows the Big Ten. He's comfortable. He should be comfortable in this league. And look, the SEC was the best league in the country this season. The SEC was perhaps the most talented league in the country this season. I wouldn't expect any drop-off from a guy coming from the SEC to the Big Ten. They're different leagues, and I feel like the SEC has a little bit more athleticism probably on the wings. The Big Ten's more a traditional back-to-the-basket big league, but that changed a little bit this year. The Big Ten was a little bit more wide open this year. Either way, neither here nor there, Pharrell Payne is a guy who's certainly a good piece in the front court who you want to put into your lineup, and I think can be a factor. Is he going to be Derik Queen? No, but nobody's going to be Derik Queen. Is he going to be Julian Reese? I wouldn't think so, but I think he's a guy who now in his 4th year of college basketball can be a very effective piece for Maryland in that front court. Another guy they add from Texas A&M is 6'7" four-man Solomon Washington. He's a guy who was at A&M with Buzz last season, started 23 games for the Aggies, and his calling card is really on the defensive side of things. He was 5th in the SEC in Evan Maya's defensive player ratings, and Buzz Williams has raved about his ability on the defensive side of the ball. He's talked about his high IQ on the defensive end, his ability to understand coverages, to process things really quickly, and he's a guy who's long, versatile, athletic. He's another rim protector, 5th in the SEC in block percentage, just ahead of his teammate Pharrell Payne. So these are two guys in the front court that I think you're going to feel their impact defensively. I think you're going to feel their impact from a rebounding perspective. And that's what A&M was really good at last season. You look at A&M's profile, especially over the past couple of seasons, and really last year, it stood out. They were an outstanding offensive rebounding team, and they were an outstanding defensive team. They were number 1 in the country in offensive rebounding percentage, and they were number 10 in the country in defensive efficiency. That was their calling card. It was hitting the glass, getting offensive rebounds, getting to the free throw line, and playing great defense. And those are two guys in the front court who will be able to do that. Are they guys that you're going to say, hey, these are our go-to guys in crunch time. We need a bucket. We're going to give them the ball. No, probably not. But these are guys that can play a critical part on a good team, as you saw last year at A&M. So those were Maryland's first 2 pickups. Now they also add a guy in Miles Rice from Indiana. He's a guy you may be familiar with from watching the Hoosiers play this season. And Miles Rice really has an incredible story. He's a guard, and his story is incredible. He was lightly recruited out of high school. He went to high school just outside Atlanta. He goes out to Washington State, and he redshirts the 2022 season. Then he's getting set to play the following season, and he's diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. He's doing chemotherapy, battling cancer for that entire season. He's able to come back the following season after being out for a year undergoing cancer treatment. He's able to play in the 2023-2024 season after battling cancer, and he has an unbelievable year out at Washington State. He leads them to the NCAA tournament for the first time since 2008. He's named the Pac-12 Freshman of the Year. He's named to the Pac-12. He's all Pac-12 first team. He averages just under 15 points per game. He leads the team in assists, and he's great at just getting to the bucket, getting to the foul line, making plays, and he was a super high usage guy for them. He led the team in usage rate. So he has this unbelievable season, this storybook season after battling cancer just the previous year before. He goes out and he leads Washington State to a season to remember for them. And after that, his stock was super high. Washington State's head coach, Kyle Smith, leaves for another job. Washington State, of course, the Pac-12 is dissolving, so Washington State is played its basketball last year in the WCC. Kyle Smith, their head coach, goes to Stanford. So Miles Rice puts his name in the transfer portal, and he was ranked super high by 24/7. He was 24th in their transfer portal rankings last year. He goes to Indiana, and he had a lackluster season in Bloomington. And really, Indiana had a lackluster season, which is why Mike Woodson is not the coach there anymore. He did not have a great year there. He struggled at times with turnovers. He wasn't really ever a great shooter in his previous season, a great outside shooter at Washington State. He shot just 27.5% from beyond the arc, but in South Bend, he shot 32.5%. So an okay shooter from the outside, but nothing to write home about. And he struggled with turnovers last season, a 21% turnover percentage. But when you look at that team, and you look at what they were, and you look at the turmoil they went to with Mike Woodson announcing that he was stepping down, midway through the season, it just felt like a team that never fit together. So I would be hopeful that Miles Rice can get back to the form he showed a couple years ago out in Pullman playing for Washington State, and that what the year that he had in Bloomington, rather, where he started for much of the early part of the season, then was moved to the bench later on, was more a symptom of what was going on with that program, which is, let's be honest, it's really been a dysfunctional program. Indiana has been a dysfunctional program for the better part of a decade now. So you can view the Miles Rice pickup in a lot of different ways. I tend to view it positively. The guy has an unbelievable story. I mean, he's the kind of guy you absolutely want to root for with a story like that. He showed what he can do a couple years ago at Washington State, and I've talked about Washington State a lot today. That is a nearly impossible place to win. He led them to an unbelievable season. He was one of the best players in the Pac-12, and I tend to believe that says more about him and what he can be than how he played a season ago in a really dysfunctional situation in Bloomington, Indiana. So he is Maryland's third and final pickup at this moment, and it looks like he will probably be the starting point guard. Now, as far as who is not coming back, well, it doesn't seem like anybody is really coming back. Jacoby Gillespie officially committed to Tennessee. Rodney Rice is the one guy, as far as that Crab 5 is concerned, who is still kind of out there and open, but the indications at this moment don't seem to be great. It doesn't seem like anything is imminent. There's been not much information about what Rodney Rice may do. It seems like he is potentially open to coming back, but there has not been much out there on what Rodney Rice may do. So I would not be surprised at all if you don't see a single player from last year's roster on the 2026 team. Maryland will basically have an entirely new team last year, because you look at who's in the transfer portal right now for Maryland. Jahari Long, who did not play last year. He was out with an injury. Malachi Palmer, who was a freshman last year, Kevin Willard recruited, seems like a good chance he'll end up at Villanova with Willard. Deshaun Harris-Smith in the portal. Braden Pierce in the portal. Jacoby Gillespie at committed to Tennessee already. Of course, Rodney Rice, I mentioned. Tafara Gapare in the portal. Jay Young in the portal. I didn't believe Jay Young had any eligibility left, but he is listed in the portal right now. Not sure if he has any eligibility left. The one guy who has not put his name in the portal is Chance Stevens, a guard who did not play at all for the Terps last season. And then, of course, you have Julian Reese out of eligibility, Jordan Geronimo out of eligibility, Selton Miguel out of eligibility, and then Derik Queen declaring for the NBA draft. So it's entirely possible that there's not a single familiar face in the lineup for Maryland next season. It does seem like those three guys who have just committed to Maryland via the transfer portal will be the guys, will be three key pieces for Maryland next season. I'm sure much more to come on the roster building and what it may look like over the next couple of weeks. And I wouldn't take this yet as a sign that Maryland can't be competitive next year by any means, because you look at Arkansas, and when John Calipari took that job over last year, they really didn't have anybody left on that team either. He made a crack in early on in his tenure. Maybe it was at his opening press conference even about something like, I met the team. There is no team. He was able to put together a team that went to the NCAA tournament last season. Now, he was able to bring a bunch of guys over with him from Kentucky, but nevertheless, he put together a team with completely new faces that went to the NCAA tournament. It is entirely possible. I'll be watching it closely to see what Buzz Williams' next moves are, who Maryland is able to add. I would personally be a big fan of bringing back Rodney Rice. I think Rodney Rice is a guy with a ton of potential. I've talked about it at length, how he is a 3-level scorer. I thought early in the season, this guy's just a shooter. Not at all. He can score at all 3 levels. He has a nice mid-range game. He can get to the basket. I really felt more comfortable with the ball in his hands in late-game situations than almost anybody on the team. And Kevin Willard even said about that Colorado State game, if Derik Queen hadn't stepped up and said, give me the MF ball in the huddle, he said he probably would have given it to Rodney Rice. I think Rodney Rice is a guy who can be an absolute star. He's a guy who has a lot of eligibility remaining. So I'm not sure what the situation is there. I'm not sure if there's interest on the part of Buzz Williams. If there's not, I'm not sure why there's not. But Rodney Rice would certainly be a guy to me who would be a good building block in putting together some sort of roster for next season that can compete, that can be competitive, and can get back to the NCAA tournament. Now, I want to end this episode by talking about one guy who won't be here next season, and Derik Queen, because he is off to the NBA draft. And I want to talk about Queen, not that there was ever a doubt that he was going to the NBA draft. Of course he was going to go. The guy had an unbelievable year, one of the best seasons in Maryland history. Of course he was going to go to the NBA draft. If you didn't think that, then I don't know what to tell you. He was always gonna go. There was no reason for Derik Queen to ever come back, and I'm sure he will be a lottery pick, and I hope he has a long, successful career in the NBA. But what I want to talk about in regard to Derik Queen is a conversation that's come up over the past couple of weeks, which is, could and should Derik Queen have his name in the rafters at the Xfinity Center? And my answer to that is a resounding yes. But more broadly, I think Maryland should have a lot more names in the rafters. You look at who's honored right now. The last person to be honored is Greivis Vasquez. Greivis Vasquez last played in 2010. His senior season was 2010. And so 15 years ago, that's the last Maryland player that's been honored, was 15 years ago. To me, things like rafters are much like the Hall of Fame. They should tell the story of the sport. They should tell the story of Maryland basketball. In this case, the rafters should tell the story of Maryland basketball. And while Gary Williams certainly had the golden era of Maryland basketball, and I thought things could have been better, and I hoped for more under Mark Turgeon and Kevin Willard, if you look at the rafters right now, it's like Maryland hasn't even played a basketball game since Gary retired. It looks like Maryland has just ceased to exist as a program. Like it's a program that hasn't made an NCAA tournament, that hasn't won big games, that hasn't done anything since the 2010 season. And that is simply not true. This program has been good since then. It's had moments since then. It hasn't been excellent. It hasn't gone to a Final Four, but there have been big moments and good players and really a whole generation of fans that have grown up since Gary Williams retired. There are 20-year-olds right now, students at Maryland, that really have no recollection of the Gary Williams era of Maryland basketball. And I kind of view it as insulting to that generation of fans that there's nobody honored right now in the rafters from that Mark Turgeon era. To me, the guy who would go up first is Melo Trimble. I mean, he's the guy who bridged the generations, bridged the gap from the Gary Williams era to the Mark Turgeon era. Mark Turgeon missed the tournament in his first 3 seasons. Melo Trimble comes in. Boom, they go to the tournament. There's excitement around Maryland basketball. They enter the Big Ten. You know, he was key. He was a key part in that transition from the ACC to the Big Ten, and he brought some excitement back to Maryland basketball because Maryland had gone through a 4-year stretch where they did not make the NCAA tournament at all. Melo steps on campus. They do. They get a 4 seed, and the excitement was back. And that launched a decent little run where they made the tournament 3 years in a row. They did get to a Sweet 16 the following season, even if the expectations were higher. It's not like this program has just been over since Gary retired. It's not like this program has stopped playing basketball. So Melo Trimble would be the first one to go in for me. I think Anthony Cowan belongs up there as well. And then I would put in Julian Reese as well because of everything I've talked about this season, about the fact that I think he is in a lot of ways a modern day Walt Williams in the way he stuck by this program. He was a rock. He was there day in and day out. He gave his all to Maryland basketball. And he was just a guy who kind of epitomizes what Maryland basketball is all about. He could have left a million times. He didn't. He chose to stay, and he was a critical part of a team that went to the Sweet 16 this year. I know the Sweet 16 is not the end-all, be-all. I know it's not like going to a Final Four, but this was one of the most fun, most exciting, best Maryland seasons in years, and Julian Reese was a huge part of that. And then the same goes for Derik Queen. Now, Derik Queen is a different case because, of course, Derik Queen only played the 1 year at Maryland, but it was an exceptional year. It was an unbelievable year, and it reminds me a lot of Steve Francis's 1 year at Maryland. No matter how you want to look at Derik Queen, he had a season for the ages at Maryland. He was the Big Ten Freshman of the Year. He was all Big Ten first team. He hit one of the most memorable game-winning shots in Maryland history. That's a shot that we will be talking about in 20, 30, 40, 50 years when you talk about Maryland basketball, when you talk about the history of Maryland basketball, when you talk about the moments that matter in Maryland basketball history. It'll be like the Drew Nicholas shot. You will be talking about that Derik Queen shot. And Derik Queen is one of the most exceptional players I've ever watched. I compare him to Steve Francis in that way because for 1 year, he was so captivating, he was so magical, and he was so good that you cannot tell the history of Maryland basketball. You will not be able to tell the history of Maryland basketball without talking about Derik Queen. I believe honoring players in the rafters should be all about telling the story of Maryland basketball, about telling the story of the players that mattered and the players that have meant the most to the program, that have meant the most to the fans, that have contributed to the biggest moments and the biggest teams and the best years in the history of the program. And I don't think there's any doubt that Derik Queen has done all of those things. So for me, my vote would be absolutely honor Derik Queen, put his name up in the rafters. He had one of the best years I've ever seen a Maryland Terrapin have. He has one of the best moments in Maryland history. He should be a guy who can go back one day, point to the rafters, and tell his kids about the year he spent in College Park and what he did. And he should be able to do that, but Maryland fans should be able to do that. A Maryland fan who is a junior at Maryland right now, who's 21 years old, should be able to take their kids there to a Maryland game in 20, 30, 40 years and say, when I was in school, I watched Derik Queen play, and he hit this shot against Colorado State, and he was one of the best players in the Big Ten, and he was unbelievable with his basketball IQ and his ability as a big man to handle the ball and his post moves and just everything he brought to the table. He should be able to point up and show his kids, that was the guy that I watched when I was in school. And I think that's what Maryland basketball is missing right now, because there's been a generation since Gary Williams retired that I could easily see feeling disenfranchised and feeling like they don't have any connection, that their guys, their players just don't matter. Melo Trimble, meaningful player. Anthony Cowan, meaningful player. Julian Reese, meaningful player. Derik Queen, extraordinarily meaningful player. So my vote would be to put all four of those guys up in the rafters. My vote would be to honor all four of them because of what I believe the rafters should represent, what I believe that should be used for. That's the show for today. I will continue to be covering the Terps all off season long. Look, there's a lot more roster building to be done. There's assistant coaching hires to be made. There is going to be so much more going on over the coming weeks with the Terps. So stay tuned right here. I'm not going anywhere. I will be back next week to talk about it all. Going to be moving to a kind of a once a week cadence here. Maybe got to figure out what the right day is, but I am not going anywhere. Don't worry about that because there is so much more to talk about throughout the months of April and May as Buzz Williams builds the roster for his very first Maryland team. That's the show for today. Until next time, this has been the Route 1 Rundown.